There's something I want to talk about because there are other troubled teen industry survivors that can relate. This is not a fun thing to talk about. There are parts of it that are just, I don't know, really painful. But I want to talk about how I ended up dumped at Paint Rock to begin with. I actually spoke this story for the first time on Thursday. But there's a detail in the story that I've been questioning for, I think, a month or two if I'm wrong about a detail. I want to believe that somebody stood up for me. In any of what happened, but I don't know if anybody stood up for me. Elsa's getting restless. Sorry, this is my cat. One of them. So yeah, so basically what happened, if my parents see this, they are not going to be thrilled about me saying this publicly, but they know this is true. I know this is true, even if they have never actually acknowledged it to my face to this day. But there were a lot of things that happened in the house that I grew up in that never should have happened, that were abuse, plain and simple. And it really messed me up, and it got to the point where eventually I felt like there was no help, there was no way out, and I started trying to end my life to get away from the abuse. I started self-harming, kind of in the same vein, like escaping from the abuse. And right at the beginning of 11th grade, I was caught at school trying to harm myself, and I had told my school what happened at home, and why I didn't want to be here anymore. And I thought they'd reported that, but now I'm questioning everything, because with the events that happened, I don't know that anybody reported anything. And that thought horrifies me. Like, they knew what was going on. But yeah, so basically, because I had been caught trying to harm myself at school, I got dumped into a psych ward. Eventually I got downgraded to going to the PHP at the psych ward, and I was home in the evenings, and things were just a lot worse at home. That's why I thought, things were reported that I mentioned at school, because of how much worse things were at home when I was home in the evenings from the PHP. It was just unbearable, and finally I literally ran away. I was picked up by a police officer. They found me. I'd gotten a decent distance from home, and I told them, I didn't want to go home because I didn't feel safe there. I told them that, I was abused at home and I didn't want to go back. And so I got dumped back in the psych ward. I refused to see my parents while I was in there. And yeah, after that I ended up dumped at Paint Rock. And, you know, I don't know a lot about how Paint Rock even came up as a thing. I know that a lot of troubled teen industry survivors were referred by educational consultants, and there was probably an educational consultant at that psych ward. And these educational consultants get kickbacks for referring kids to these torture camps, basically. So if that's how I ended up at Paint Rock, yeah, whoever referred me probably got paid pretty well for it, you know? I'm lucky because, you know, I know at least within my Paint Rock group, there was at least one girl that was kidnapped from her bed in the middle of the night, condoned by her parents, by the way, you know, kidnapped by strangers and brought to Paint Rock. And there was another girl in my group who was kidnapped and brought to a much worse wilderness program before going to Paint Rock. So I'm lucky, you know, because I can't even imagine getting kidnapped in the middle of the night like a lot of troubled teen survivors do. I'd probably have even worse nightmares than I already do if I had been through that. But yeah, I mean, I thought for the longest time when I was at Paint Rock and New Beginnings that I wasn't even in my parents' custody because, well, I didn't find this out until recently, but apparently a lot of troubled teen programs tell parents to purge all of their kids' belongings. I'm really lucky that there were some things from childhood that were saved. It was mostly stuff that Mom also kind of found sentimental, or that were expensive things like American Girl dolls, you know, that kind of thing. But I don't have any of my journals from 9th or 10th grade. Mom actually read them and, you know, said they were toxic waste, and to this day I'm really reluctant to journal in anything that could be read. I do the majority of my journaling in a journaling app that can lock, and I lock it with a code that nobody would be able to guess. So, you know, whenever I die, you know, whether that's tomorrow or decades from now, you know, like, my journal is gonna go with me. Nobody's gonna be able to read it. And that's how I want it, you know, because of that experience of Mom reading my journals and, you know, saying they were toxic waste. Because I did mention the abuse. You know, she probably didn't like that, you know. There's still never been acknowledgement to my face. You know, she's told at least one sibling that she had a depressive episode when I was younger. But there's never been acknowledgement to my face of any of the abuse. But I digress. But yeah, so yeah, I had a lot of my stuff purged. I had, you know, books that I had in childhood combined with the family supply of books. I had a lot of my stuff either purged, donated, given to other siblings, combined with the family supply. There were a few things that, you know, after I aged out, you know, and got out of there once I was 18, you know, that I claimed back, you know. But yeah, there was a lot that was purged. So yeah, that was one reason why I thought I was, completely out of my parents' custody. Another reason is on the one home pass I had through the entire 2 years, they had given my bedroom to my sister Emily. So I didn't even have a bedroom anymore. So that was another thing. And when I came back, when I briefly stayed at my parents' house before moving on campus at a college, I was staying in a room that used to belong to my brothers. There was, another reason I thought I was outside of my parents' custody was that after I finally aged out, things were a bit different, and it seemed like something had changed where, they were still emotionally abusive, but the physical abuse had stopped, and I've kept a watchful eye because I have a sibling that's 20 years younger than me, but that seemed to have stopped by the time, I got out of New Beginnings. So, yeah, I think the change happened at some point, while I was away. So there was that. I also think the change may have happened specifically while I was at New Beginnings, but that's a story for another day. For why I have reasons to suspect that. Because there was something that happened while I was at Paint Rock. One of my brothers tried to report my mom for abuse, and my mom took him to a local police station, and the police officer explained what abuse was. But it's like, if the police officer had taken time to actually talk to my brother, the stuff that was happening at home was abuse. It absolutely was. But no, I doubt the police officer even talked to my brother about, or asked, my brother what was going on before going into some BS description of what abuse was. And my brother never spoke up again. And that really bothers me. And I do remember Mom bragging about that. I don't know. It's so complicated. There were legit, foster kids at both Paint Rock and New Beginnings. And at least at Paint Rock, I remember at least 2 of those foster kids talking about their foster parents. So I didn't think anything of having, contact, if they had contact with theirs. I don't know, to be fair, what I thought about things at the time, this is all coming from a kid brain, trying to process trauma as best I could, especially with being dumped in an environment that was so bad that my brain literally blocked out parts of Paint Rock. There are a lot of memories that have been coming back over the past year, unfortunately, But I mean, well, and there's, you know, when I was first dumped at Paint Rock, I was fed the lie that I'd be there for 6 weeks. You know, and that was bull. A load of bull. You know, just saying. Especially since I think it took most people closer to like 2 years if they graduated from either Paint Rock or New Beginnings. Yeah. Well, and Paint Rock was horrifying in the beginning anyway, because, you know, the way how I learned rules when I first got there was basically by accidentally breaking them. You know, they wouldn't tell me, you know, up front, these are the rules, and then, you know, if the tornado hadn't hit at Paint Rock, there was another memory I wanted to talk about in a video. You know, we had meals in the dining hall in that cafeteria thing. Well, three meals a day, Monday through Friday, and then 1 meal on Sunday. And my first meal there, you know, each group, there were like 5 groups when I first got there. During the time that I was there, there was a massive group switching event, and basically it was pared down to 4 groups. One of the groups, Watalahi, was disbanded. But yeah, so there were like 5 groups lined up, you know, sitting in various places along the deck of the dining hall. And, you know, I was asking, what is everybody doing? What are all these groups? And, so when you first get there, you're on buddy level, and you have a buddy watcher, another peer in your group that's a higher level. And my buddy watcher said, you're not supposed to notice the groups. It's like, okay, why? What's going on? Can somebody please tell me? You know, I'm lucky I didn't talk to another group person to find out what was going on, or someone outside of our group, because, I mean, yeah, I'm afraid to know. They probably would have done the campsited thing, even though, you know, I was new and nobody told me what was going on. You know, there were so many things that I learned by trial and error. I mean, having to tuck in, you know, they didn't explain how they wanted the beds made in the morning. We slept in a cabin. Basically, there was a sheet over this plastic mattress on a bunk bed, and then the sleeping bag went over that. Nobody explained that they wanted that sheet tucked in, you know, all around the mattress. And of course, when you're first there, they put you on a top bunk, you know, make it harder to run away. And yeah, so that first morning, I got in trouble over and over for my bed not being right. And it's like, just tell me, like, I didn't say this, but I just, in my head, I'm like, just tell me what you want. You know, I can't guess. You know, oh my gosh, it was awful. There were just so many things. So, like, that first, you know, nobody told me that I wasn't supposed to talk to anyone else on buddy level, and there was another girl on buddy level that, yeah, she came off buddy level before I did, but nobody told me that, you know. And I think I got the non-com punishment, if I remember, for asking her a question about the rules, like, what are we, but yeah, I got in trouble over and over and over. And honestly, like, outside of home, I really didn't normally get in trouble a lot, like, other than, the self-harm stuff I started doing to try to escape, the abusive home environment. I wasn't that bad of a kid, other than, at home where, basically you breathe wrong, you get in trouble. I mean, that's just, yeah, so that was pretty traumatic at Paint Rock, learning the rules by getting in trouble over and over and over. And I think they do that on purpose because it's just kind of, I don't know, getting it through your brain that you're a bad person. Because look, you can't even follow the rules. You're breaking them over and over and over. I think that was on purpose to break you down. Like, I think a lot of the abusive things that happened at Paint Rock were to break you down. But yeah. So there's that. But yeah, I guess I should have known this whole time that my parents dumped me in there, that I wasn't actually out of their custody. I should have known. But it just bothers me that nobody stood up for me before I got dumped at Paint Rock. My school knew what was going on at home. I told them, including right before I ended up in that psych ward. I told a cop, when I ran away, when things were unbearable at home, I said, I don't feel safe there. I'm being abused. I don't want to go back. And nothing. They didn't do anything. The church I grew up in turned a blind eye towards abuse. And that still bothers me to this day. Yeah, so it's kind of horrifying realizing I think I was alone, before Paint Rock. Nobody helped. Nobody stood up for me. And I ended up dumped in an even more abusive environment. And then, when I aged out, when I finally got out of there, I was alone, because, my name had been driven through the mud while I was gone, so it's one of the reasons that I just I stopped going to the church I grew up in except for occasions. Because I did go to school for a little bit at a women's college, kind of near where I grew up. It was torture. Yeah, I hated that school, but anyway. Yeah, well, and it's like, my name was, I think driven through the mud with people I knew from the school I went to before Paint Rock, so, I felt like I didn't have that support system either. And of course, with coming out of Paint Rock and New Beginnings, I was traumatized, and, I didn't know I had complex PTSD back then. I came out completely unprepared to deal with the real world. And I'm not the only one, kids who end up in the troubled teen industry come out, dealing with similar effects to people who have been in jail for years. Incarceration, it's really hard to... I've never been in jail. I should mention this. I have never been in jail, and I intend to never experience what that's like. But yeah, to be fair, from what I've heard, it sounds like people in jail are treated better than teens in troubled teen programs. Well, kids and teens, because there's kids as young as like 10 or 11 and or even younger in some. Yeah, people in jail have more rights than a lot of people on death row have more rights than kids in troubled teen programs. That's been an interesting thing that I've learned recently. Yeah, so coming out, I know I probably was like really weird to everyone. You know, I'd been kind of I guess indoctrinated is a good way to put it, with, you know, how, you know, just sold the idea that the world works how things work in the troubled teen industry, and no, like, they don't. I mean, and probably doesn't help that I'm autistic and socially awkward. I've always, you know, had that, you know, had trouble reading people. Yeah, so, I mean, I don't keep in touch with really anyone I knew at that women's college anymore. I might still be friends with a few of them on Facebook, but I don't interact. I don't know. I did not fit in at that. Yeah, I mean, well, and eventually I moved to Florida. Living with my parents obviously was toxic, you know, hence the running away onto campus and living on campus during the school year. And then over the summer, I lived with my grandparents in Florida. And then the next year, since I hated my college, I was miserable. And it was really easy at the time to find work in Florida. You know, because the tourist industry, all that. I moved permanently to Florida the next year, you know, with my grandparents, and I wanted to drop out of school then, but I stayed in school because it was a condition of living under the roof. And eventually I moved out and lived on campus at a college in Florida. Well, and then a bunch of other stuff happened, but that's another story for another day. But yeah, I'm sure I was weird through all those years. I mean, I was brainwashed too, you know, like, it makes me mad that so many kids that end up in the troubled teen industry are blanket diagnosed with bipolar. And, of course, being young, autistic, impressionable, I believed that wrong diagnosis. You know, and I stayed on those horrible meds for 10 extra years. And those meds, you know, I started having seizures when I was in New Beginnings. They stopped for a couple years. And then they started again, I think, when I was like 24. I think that, yeah, it was around the time I became homeless. But yeah, like, if I had known it was the meds causing that, I would have come off them. But well, I guess towards the end, I was wondering, you know, and because I remember bringing that up with the psychiatrist I was seeing at the time, and just, it's like any side effects were shrugged off, like nobody listened to me. You know, it just makes me so mad. I didn't know that I had complex PTSD and autism and not bipolar until I ended up living in New Zealand for a while and actually got proper help, you know, proper mental health care. You know, there's another embarrassing thing that I'm ashamed of, but I want to get this out there in case there are other troubled teen survivors that can relate. You know, I was told at one point that what actually, eventually, I found out more than a decade later were flashbacks. You know, I was told were hallucinations, and I believed that they were hallucinations, and that probably made me sound crazier than I actually was. And it makes me so mad. You know, nobody asked me what I was seeing, what was going on, like when they were happening, what I was, you know, experiencing. And it probably didn't help that the meds I was on made them more vivid. So, but I mean, you know, if you know anything about the kinds of flashbacks that war veterans have, you know, basically what I was having was similar to that, where it literally felt like I was literally back in the bad thing, you know, the bad time where I was getting hurt. You know, like, luckily, you know, a lot of the time, you know, all I'd see were shadows, but, you know, when I felt safe for the first time in my life, you know, when I was living in New Zealand, you know, I knew what I was seeing, you know, because memories came back more fully, you know, and, I mean, yeah, my counselor asked questions that no previous counselor ever asked. Even though, like, these things, you know, sometimes happened in session when I was talking about trauma. Nobody ever asked me what I was seeing, what I was feeling, you know? And it's like, you're not having hallucinations, you're having flashbacks. That would have been nice to know, because, you know, I'm embarrassed that this, you know, that whole time, up until I was like 30, you know, it was something I was ashamed of. And it made me sound crazier. It made it harder, you know, to talk or to tell anyone about abuse and be believed about the abuse, because no one's gonna believe somebody who's having hallucinations. I am so angry at being told at Paint Rock, I'm pretty sure it was Paint Rock, because that what was happening was hallucinations, because I'm sorry, it was not. And they never should have told me that. They never should have told an impressionable autistic teen, already traumatized, already in a place, you know, that was crazy making. I mean, already in a place where, you know, we were being abused and then, you know, told that that was treatment, and, you know, had it drilled into us that we were bad and that we needed that we deserved that, and it just makes me so angry. Yeah, anyway, so that's a long rambling video about a lot of things, but yeah, there's a lot. And it's just shocking, as I've gotten, in contact with other survivors, even of other programs, and, joined support groups, been part of online survivor communities, finding out how many things we have in common, finding out that I'm not crazy, finding out just the number of us who were just blanket diagnosed with bipolar and didn't actually have bipolar. The number of us who were put on all those high doses of psych meds that are not recommended for kids. The high number of us that had all or at least most of our stuff purged at home. How many programs tell parents to do that, finding out that I'm not the only one who thought I was in foster care or out of my parents' custody somehow, while I was in there because of, all the things, not having a bedroom anymore, my stuff being purged, just... Yeah, it's crazy just finding out that there are others who have been through just the same things, had similar experiences, and finding out that I'm not alone. In some ways it's comforting, and in some ways it just makes me want to scream, because I want to change things. I want to protect other kids from experiencing this stuff. I want to protect other kids from believing that they're crazy for decades. I want to protect other kids from abuse that is so bad that, it pretty much affects you for life. As an adult, I've struggled to work more than part-time, and struggled to finish school. I did finish a 2-year degree, which is good because I have concerns that my high school diploma, which I earned at Three Springs New Beginnings, might not be valid. I have significant concerns that, just like other troubled teen programs that claim to be accredited and aren't, I definitely have significant concerns that Three Springs Paint Rock Valley and Three Springs New Beginnings weren't either. There's no way, if anyone was actually doing their job, there's no way that anyone should have accredited either of those two places based on how school was there. There's no way. I slept through school at Paint Rock. I was doing 3rd grade spelling tests and 12th grade English at New Beginnings and playing educational computer games like Zoombinis, I think was the name of one of them. Basically elementary school level educational games. They did bring in a, teacher for calculus, so I learned a little bit of calculus, but there was nothing else, and no one would, I'm sorry, if somebody was actually doing their job and truly checking out the schools, no, neither of those places should have been accredited at all, if they were at all. Yeah, so there's that.